Hello, whiskey investigators. This is Whiskey Whistle, and I'm your host, Mark. Today we're looking at a bourbon called Maker's Mark. And I'm sure you've heard of this one before because it's quite famous. Maker's Mark comes from Kentucky. This is a straight bourbon. Straight bourbon meaning that it has been aged for 2 or more years. So let's get that cracked and get it open. Maker's Mark Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey happens to be roughly about 6 years old, give or take, and it's bottled at 45% ABV. Probably the most recognizable thing about this bottle is the wax seal, and in fact that is a trademark of Maker's Mark. So that's a trademark of Maker's Mark, and my name is Mark, and well, it's quite distinctive, isn't it? Let's get it poured and we'll talk a little bit about the distillery, and then we will taste and smell and talk about the finish, actually in the reverse order. It needs just a dash more, doesn't it? Look at the color of that. This is basically like a copper shade, quite dark. And if you're not familiar with bourbon, the reason for that is that this is matured in absolute virgin toasted oak, probably charred oak barrels. There we go. Another cool thing you'll see about that one, normally American whiskey is spelled with an E, but if you look at that one, you'll see that Maker's Mark, in fact, only uses just a Y, W-H-I-S-K-Y. That, I believe, is one of about 3 or 4 brands that simply uses the W-H-I-S-K-Y spelling. There we are. Well, let's talk a little bit about the distillery. Before we do that, there will be a short advertisement right here. Thank you for coming back. Maker's Mark. So the distillery, well, distillery's history is quite long. Normally, previously known as, I believe, Burke's Distillery, and purchased by, oh shoot, I forget the name of the fellow. Anyway, 1958 is when Maker's Mark hit the market. This is a wheated bourbon. Wheated meaning that wheat plays a large role in the mash bill. And in fact, there is absolutely no rye whatsoever in Maker's Mark. So that's quite different from most bourbons. They use, in fact, a red winter wheat, apparently. I mentioned it's 45% ABV, so that's great. Roughly 6 years old, also great. And a little bit about the history. The founder apparently tried seven different mash bills, and I think he had a little bit of help from none other than the same company that makes the Pappy Van Winkle bourbons. And rather than try and actually make whiskey using 7 different mash bills, which would take at least 2 years given that it's straight whiskey, what they did was they baked a loaf of bread using the different mash bills, and the one without rye was chosen as the best tasting bread, and this is how this whiskey brand was born. Now this is small batch, which is rather ambiguous. However, the company has gone ahead and stated what their definition of small batch means, and that is that they use less than 200 barrels to blend together for one batch. So is it a small batch? Is it a large batch? Well, I think it's a lot smaller than some, so small batch. Now, also on the label, you'll see it says handmade, and apparently there's been a little bit of controversy about that as well. First of all, whiskey cannot be made by hand. Whiskey must be made with a still. It must be fired. It has to be separated into heads and tails and hearts. Then it has to be put into vats, and it needs to be, I think it needs to be churned a little bit. And then finally it gets filled into casks. And all of this is done largely by automation. And so what does it mean is handmade? Someone is going to be monitoring the equipment. Someone is going to be checking the quality of the mash. Someone will be checking the quality of the distillate. Someone checks the quality of the casks. And they watch the maturity of the casks as they age. And finally they bottle them. And well, apparently the wax seal is certainly done from hand, but like any other product made in a factory, how much hand involvement is there? And is it enough to call it handmade? And well, that's debatable. But as far as whiskey is concerned, I bet they've got more hands touching the product here at Burke's Distillery, Maker's Mark, than a lot of other whiskey brands all over the world. Okay, anyway, let's read this a little bit here. Maker's Mark is America's only handmade bourbon whiskey, never mass-produced. Each individual batch is less than 19 barrels. 19 barrels in fact. And this small quantity means we can be choosy about everything we use and everything that we do to craft our whiskey. That's why we use the old style sour mash method. We start each new batch fermentation by using a little bit of the last, resulting in a more consistent product. We're proud of our unique and full-flavored handmade bourbon, and so we add our Maker's Mark to each bottle. Enjoy. Bill Samuels Jr., President, Maker's Mark. And a little bit more here. It says, anytime you're in the neighborhood, stop by and visit us at our distillery near Loretto, Kentucky. This beautifully restored home of Maker's Mark is a designated Kentucky and National Historic Landmark. Fully matured alcohol, 45% by volume, 90 proof. There you have it. Now, I didn't mention the master distiller, who is Greg Davis, and there he is. So cheers to you, Mr. Davis, and let's try that together now, shall we? We'll have another short advertisement right here. Welcome back to WhiskyWhistle. In case you forgot, my name is Mark, and I'm reviewing Maker's Mark. If you are new to bourbon, this will smell like bourbon. If you have been enjoying bourbon for a while, you'll probably notice that there's a whole lot of spice going on in Maker's Mark. Lots of cinnamon. Big oak. And yet there's some sweetness in the background there. It's quite sharp on the nose, in fact, even though I'm trying to get used to it. They say when you smell something, if you really want to get the best possible smelling, you need to open your mouth slightly, like this. That is potent. The smell reminds me of cinnamon hearts a little bit. And my notes here, I wrote nose vanilla cinnamon oaky. Okay, let's check the palate now. We'll try that. We'll check out the taste. Cheers, everyone. It's quite buttery. And interestingly, now I can really taste the wheat. If you have tried honeyed wheat, which I believe is called kuche, if you happen to be Ukrainian or Polish, kuche is wheat, like the grain wheat, which has been, I believe, steamed or soaked in water overnight, and then had honey added to it. Kind of like a cold porridge. And the palate I wrote starts out sweet, then it gets a little bit of the sour bitterness coming through. I wrote here classic bourbon, vanilla spice. It's dry, there's cloves, honey, and creamy. And that weedy flavor that I'm tasting now, which I didn't notice earlier. Very nice indeed. The finish is long. And I've got here cinnamon and clove, apples, honey. A little bit dry, which is nice. We'll try this one more time. This has a lot to offer. A little bit of a mintiness coming through with apples. It's still very wheaty, which is nice. We'll add some water now. Given that it's 45% and I've got about 40 milliliters in there still, I am going to go ahead and add 1.5. So that's about 3.5 milliliters of water added. Now, Maker's Mark is certainly one of the more famous bourbons. A lot of people talk about it. This is a lot of people's favorite everyday bourbon, and I can see why. Now, if it seems like I'm a little bit on the tired side, I do apologize. It's actually nearly 5 a.m. here on, I guess that is May 7th, 2016. And I've done this is my third review I've done tonight. So if you've been watching, you'll notice that the shirt I'm wearing is the same, and the camera angle is roughly the same, so that might tell you that, that I've recorded them all in one day. It's a little secret. Okay, so with water, let's see what happens here. really becomes buttery. And I wrote here apple crisp with cinnamon. What's apple crisp? It's a baked dessert. You've got baked apples on the bottom with cinnamon and sugar. And then you've got a flour mixture with brown sugar and butter on the top. And then you bake it. And you get that kind of a crispy, crumbly top on top of almost like something like applesauce, but with big chunks of apple in there. It's not quite as dry with water. It's creamier and still lots and lots of honey there. Now, I believe this is my 4th bourbon. I'll put a link at the end of this to guide you to my other bourbon reviews if you're a bourbon fan. Anyway, the finish though, with water, we get a little bit of a rum-esque finish going on there. Again, which is very, very welcome. Great. Let me just add a dash more to see if there's anything else that goes on here. It's still quite strongly flavored, so I think it's okay if you add yourself a fair bit of water, or if you like it cold and you want to put an ice cube in there, that, go ahead. With ice, though, you probably lose a little bit of the subtle flavors, and you'd be left with just kind of a cinnamon vanilla sweetness, I think. Here we are. Cheers, everyone. That rum character really comes out with water. Now, why would that be? Well, rum is aged in casks, just like Scotch whiskey, just like bourbon. Rum uses sugar or sugar cane. Whiskey uses grain. But when it is being mashed and fermented, the sugars are fermented. And some of the sugars in grain are the very same as those in brown sugar or white sugar, or anyway, sugar cane. So there could be some overlap in terms of flavors. So it's not really unusual to say that the bourbon has a little bit of a rum flavor to it. And you really notice that with water added. It's milder. You've got a sugary rum kind of flavor going on. And in the finish, some mint, a bit of clove, vanilla, some apple skins, in fact. So a little bit dry. And still quite a lot of honey. So anyway, Maker's Mark, 45% ABV. The WhiskyWhistle whiskey score for Maker's Mark will be 82 out of 100. And I wrote here, it's a good bourbon. It's at a great strength, lots of classic flavors. And 82, well, anyway, 82, we'll leave it at that. I quite like it. It is a fine, fine bourbon. And enjoyable using the red winter wheat rather than rather than rye. So it's unique in that sense. Okay, so 82 out of 100, that is the Whiskey Whistle whiskey score for Maker's Mark. And if you have watched all the way up till now, I'm sure hoping that you will subscribe. So you can do so just by clicking the link right down there in the corner. Okay, right down there. So subscribe, and that way you'll keep up with all of the Whiskey Whistles. Okay? So again, my name is Mark. You've watched Whiskey Whistle. Take care and have yourself a great weekend.